For our last study, we got into a small discussion about Gideon after finishing our discussion of Deborah. To start today, we're going to get into Gideon again, but to start, I would like again to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 4. This is the verse that we discussed last time, and I'd like to discuss a little bit more from 1 Corinthians 4. Starting in verse 1, "This then is how you ought to regard us, as servants of Christ, and as those entrusted with the mysteries God has revealed. Now it is required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, judge nothing until the appointed time. Wait until the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of the heart. At that time, each will receive their praise from God." Now, we talked a little bit last time about how God entrusts. In fact, we went to 1 Corinthians 5:7, in which we discussed, "Get rid of the old yeast so that you may be a new unleavened batch as you really are." Now, Gideon was one person who did not see himself as God saw him. And we discussed this a little bit, but we're really going to get into Gideon today. And we're going to talk about the insecurities that Gideon had. Now, we're going to see where Gideon was found faithful with the trust that God had given him. And we're going to discuss that a little bit more in a moment. If we turn to Judges chapter 6, we started last week and discussed how Gideon was hiding from the Midianites. He had wheat that he was thrashing in a wine cellar, basically, a wine press where he could not be seen because of his fear of the Midianites. I'm going to start there again a little bit, just to give a little introduction into the life of Gideon. "Then the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak that was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, as his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress in order to save it from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, 'The Lord is with you, O valiant warrior.'" Again, you notice how God saw Gideon when it says a valiant warrior. "Then Gideon said to him, 'O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are his miracles, which our father told us about, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian.' The Lord looked at him and said, 'Go in this your strength, and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you?'" Now, God was telling Gideon to go in strength, in God's strength, because he had sent Gideon to defeat Midian. Again, notice that God was seeing Gideon as he really was, as a valiant warrior. Now, notice Gideon's response in verse 15. He said to him, "O Lord, how shall I deliver Israel? Behold, my family is the least in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house." But the Lord said to him, "Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat Midian as one man." So Gideon is very humble. You know, last night I was watching the movie Prince Caspian with my family, and there's one scene in which Prince Caspian is talking with Aslan and tells him that he does not see how he could be king. And at that point, Aslan says, "That's what will make you a good king." And I notice this attitude in Gideon. Gideon does not see himself as anything, but that is what made him the valiant warrior that God wanted him to be. In verse 17 we read, "So Gideon said to him, 'If now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who speak with me. Please do not part from here until I come back to you, and bring out my offering and lay it before you.' And he said, 'I will remain until you return.'" So Gideon is asking God for a sign. Now that shows the lack of Gideon's faith, his insecurities. But if you notice, Gideon's insecurity was not with God, it was with himself. And I believe that is why God said that he would remain and he would give Gideon the signs that he needed. "Then Gideon went in and prepared a young goat and unleavened bread from an ephah of flour. He put the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot, and brought them out to him under the oak and presented them. The angel of God said to him, 'Take the meat and the unleavened bread and lay them on this rock and pour out the broth.' And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. Then the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight." So God gave him a sign that he did not even ask for. He made fire consume the food that he had prepared. Verse 22, "When Gideon saw that he was the angel of the Lord, he said, 'Alas, O Lord God, for now I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face.' The Lord said to him, 'Peace to you, do not fear, you shall not die.' Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and named it, 'The Lord is Peace.' To this day it is still in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Now on the same night the Lord said to him, Take your father's bull and a second bull 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal which belongs to your father, and cut down the Asherah which is beside it. Now these were the sites of idol worship in the time of Gideon. And God is telling Gideon, go pull down those altars to these idols. Now not only were they altars of the Israelites, they were altars of Gideon's father. Now God had just told him not to be afraid. Let's see how Gideon reacts to that. Then Gideon took 10 of his men and servants, and did as the Lord had spoken to him. And because he was too afraid of his father's household and the men of the city to do it by day, he did it by night. Now he did it at night, he still obeyed God, but because he was afraid, he went by night and pulled down these altars of his father. So that's very interesting. We see again Gideon's insecurity, but he still obeyed despite his fear. Now it's very interesting, again, last week we talked about Hebrews 4:15, in which God sympathizes with our weaknesses, and I think that's the perfect verse that shows God sympathized with Gideon's weakness, because he did not condemn him for doing it by night. He understood his fear, and Gideon obeyed despite his fear. Now it's very interesting that there's a few more signs that Gideon asked for in preparation for defeating the Midianites. And we're going to read a little bit about those, and again how God helped Gideon through his insecurities to be that valiant warrior that he told him he was initially. In verse 34 of chapter 6 we read, So the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called together to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, and they were also called together to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they came up to meet him. Then Gideon said to God, If you will deliver Israel through me as you have spoken, behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I will know that you will deliver Israel through me as you have spoken. And it was so. When he arose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he drained the dew from the fleece and a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, Do not let your anger burn against me, that I may speak once more. Please let me test once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, and let there be dew on all the ground. God did so that night, for it was dry only on the fleece and dew on all the ground. So those are the two signs that Gideon is infamous for. He asked for the fleece to be wet and the ground to be dry, and the ground to be wet and the fleece to be dry. And if you notice his wording, it's not that he did not trust God. He did not understand why God would choose him. Now that is important in our walk with God. So often the devil comes against us, and he plays on our insecurities and makes us feel that we could never do anything worthy for God. I don't think I have ever really known of a teacher, or have even some of the very famous Bible instructors, so many of them have said that there was one point in their life when they really felt attacked and they were just ready to give up totally on what God had told them to do. I think that is what Gideon is experiencing. But if you notice, God again showed him that he was working through him. The next verse is very interesting, the next chapter I should say, chapter 7, and this is where Gideon does go to defeat the Midianites. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 7, Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and camped beside the spring of Harod, and the camp of Midian was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, The people who are with you are too many for me to give Midian into their hands, for Israel would become boastful, saying, My own power has delivered me. Now, God sees all the people that are with Gideon, and he is ready for Gideon to go defeat the Midianites. But if you notice, he's going to shrink Gideon's army. And notice his reasoning, because the people of Israel would become boastful. Now remember that when we're talking about Gideon's insecurities and his own heart, he didn't see himself as anything at all. And we're going to notice something that is said specifically about Gideon and about God in a moment. But realize again that God is shrinking Gideon's army so that Israel does not become boastful. Now this is again God speaking, continuing in verse 3. Now therefore come, proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, Whoever is afraid and trembling, let him return and depart from Mount Gilead. So 22,000 people returned, but 10,000 remained. So we see that out of all these 30,000 people that were there with Gideon, 22,000 of them left. There were only 10,000 people that remained that were willing to fight with Gideon. Continuing in verse 4, Then the Lord said to Gideon, "The people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. Therefore it shall be that he of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, he shall go with you. But every one of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go." So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, "You shall separate every one who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, as well as every one who kneels to drink." Now the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 30 men, but all of the rest of the people kneeled to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, "I will deliver you with the 300 men who lapped, and will give the Midianites into your hands. So let all the other people go, each to his own home." So this is very interesting how God tested him as he took them to the water, and he let each one of them get a drink. And he said, now some of the people are going to pick up the water and drink it out of their hands, where the others are going to lean down and lap the water as a dog laps the water. And if you notice, it says that the number who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. So the ones that picked up the water and drank it from their hands were the ones that God kept. I've heard it suggested it's because that those who actually kneeled down into the water would have been caught unaware by their enemies, where those who brought the water up to them with their hand were still aware of their surroundings and of anyone who may possibly attack. So if we now continue in in chapter 8, verse 8 of chapter 7. So the 300 men took the people's provisions and their trumpets into their hands. And Gideon sent all the other men of Israel, each to his own tent, but retained the 300 men, and the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. Now that's very interesting. Only 300 men are going to fight with Gideon. Verse 9, now the same night it came about that the Lord said to him, "Arise, go down to the camp, for I have given it into your hands. But if you are afraid to go down, go with Purah your servant down to the camp, and that you will hear what they say, and afterward your hands will be strengthened that you may go down against the camp." Now this is very, very interesting what Gideon is going to hear the Midianites say. We're going to continue starting in verse 13. We're going to skip a couple of verses there about Gideon going down into the camp. Now this is very interesting. I believe this was God's encouragement for Gideon, to show him as he really truly was, to help him feel secure in himself, not only in God but in himself, and to dispel the attacks that were coming against him, what I believe was coming against him from the enemy. When Gideon came, behold, a man was relating a dream to his friend. And he said, "Behold, I had a dream. A loaf of barley was tumbling into the camp of Midian, and it came to the tent and struck it, so that it fell, and turned it upside down, so that the tent lay flat." His friend replied, "This is nothing less than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, the man of Israel. God has given Midian and all the camp into his hand." Now, you have to understand that barley at that time was the least of the grains. It was not a fine grain. It was not a grain that people desired. It was not a grain that was had by wealthy people. It was a poor man's bread. That is exactly how Gideon saw himself, something that was of the least quality. And this dream that this man had was that this loaf of barley bread fell into the camp of the Midians and crushed them, basically. It turned over their tents. So when Gideon heard this dream, he knew that that was from God. In verse 15, then Gideon heard the account of the dream and its interpretation. He bowed in worship. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, "Arise, for the Lord has given the camp of Midian into your hands." He divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put trumpets and empty pitchers into the hands of all of them, with torches inside the pitchers. He said to them, "Look at me and do likewise, and behold, when I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I and all who are with me blow the trumpet, then you also blow the trumpets all around the camp, and say, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" Now this is a part that I really wanted to get to. First of all, you notice God not only dwindled the army and shrank the army, he also took their weapons and gave them pitchers and torches. Just something to make noise with. This is very reminiscent of the Battle of Jericho. That's a lot what it reminds me of. It's simply the noise that God is going to defeat the Midians with. Notice the wording, that they were going to defeat the Midianites for the Lord and for Gideon. Now remember, the whole reason that the army was dwindled down, that God shrank the army, was so that Israel would not be boastful. But notice here, he is building Gideon up to show him as he really was in his own sight. Verse 19, so Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just posted the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the pitchers that were in their hands. And when the three companies blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers, they held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing, and cried, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." So notice again how they did this. They had the torches in their left hand and they had the pitchers in their right, and they were making all of this noise. Again, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. When they blew 300 trumpets, the Lord set the sword of one against another, even throughout the whole army, and the army fled. The Midianites were so scared that they fled at the noise. They didn't even need the sword to defeat them because God was with them. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against Midian and take the waters before them, as far as Beth-barah and the Jordan." So all the men of Ephraim were summoned, and they took the waters as far as Beth-barah and the Jordan. They captured the two leaders of Midian, Oreb and Zeeb, and they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and they killed Zeeb at the winepress of Zeeb, while they pursued Midian. And they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeeb to Gideon from across the Jordan. So the Midianites were defeated, their heads were brought to Gideon, and God showed Gideon what he really was. That is so important for us today. God has a plan for each one of us. He has entrusted us, and we have to remember what that plan is from God. It is God who is our strength.